In the mountains of France and Italy during World War II, German forces encountered an enemy unlike any they had faced before, a regiment of soldiers who would become the most decorated unit for its size in American military history. These warriors fought with such ferocity, such determination, that they earned a reputation that spread through enemy ranks like wildfire. But these men fought two battles, one against Nazi Germany on the fields of Europe, and another against the prejudice and injustice in their own country. A country that had imprisoned their families behind barbed wire. This is the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The story of how young Japanese Americans proved their loyalty with blood and sacrifice. The story of how they changed the course of a war, and the course of American history. December the 7th, 1941, a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. 17-year-old Daniel Inouye was getting ready for church when the sky erupted with explosions. He rushed outside to see Japanese aircraft attacking Pearl Harbor. Black smoke rose in towering columns. Ships burned in the harbor. America was at war. In one morning, everything changed. For young Japanese Americans like Inouye, the attack didn't just plunge their country into war, it plunged their entire community into suspicion and fear. The next day, Inouye tried to volunteer for military service. He was turned away. Japanese Americans were suddenly classified as enemy aliens, unfit to serve the country of their birth. Within months, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It was a decision that would test the very soul of American democracy. Over 120,000 people of Japanese descent, most of them American citizens born on American soil, were forced from their homes. They were given days, sometimes hours, to sell everything they owned. Businesses were abandoned, homes were lost, families were torn apart. They were sent to war relocation centers, a bureaucratic name for what they truly were: concentration camps in the American desert. Frank Wada was just a teenager when soldiers came to his family's home in California. He remembers being loaded onto trains with no idea where they were going. "We ended up in the Santa Anita racetrack," he would later recall, living in the horse stables. And they were dirty. After 2.5 months, another train took the Wada family to Poston, Arizona, a camp in the Sonoran Desert that became Arizona's third largest town during the war, with a population of nearly 18,000. Life in the camps was brutal. Temperatures in summer soared above 120 degrees. Dust storms swept through the barracks. There was no running water in the living quarters, no privacy, minimal health care. Families coaxed vegetable gardens out of parched desert soil and made homes out of tar paper barracks with gaps in the walls. The Munamori family, widowed mother Nawa and her children, found themselves at Manzanar, another desolate camp surrounded by guard towers and barbed wire in the California desert. Her son Sadao, who had volunteered for the army just 1 month before Pearl Harbor, was already in basic training. He wrote to his mother, "Only a small percentage of soldiers die in combat, Mum. The bullets will not be marked for me, I know. Please don't worry." His mother hung a blue star flag in her barrack window, a symbol that she had a son serving in the military. She kept a photograph of Sadao close, praying for his safe return. Japanese American men were reclassified by the military as Force C, enemy aliens, and barred from serving in the armed forces. Their loyalty to America was questioned simply because their grandparents had been born in Japan, but the Nisei, the second generation born in America, refused to accept this judgment. In Hawaii, 170 Japanese American students at the University of Hawaii formed the Varsity Victory Volunteers. They petitioned the military governor with a powerful message: "Hawaii is our home, the United States our country. We know but one loyalty, and that is to the stars and stripes. We wish to do our part as loyal Americans in every way possible, and we hereby offer ourselves for whatever service you may see fit to use us." They were put to work doing manual labor, building roads, constructing barracks, stringing barbed wire, backbreaking work that would have broken lesser spirits, but they persevered. They were determined to prove their loyalty, no matter the cost. By early 1943, the War Department faced a critical shortage of troops. Casualties were mounting in Europe and the Pacific. The military needed more men. On January 28, 1943, War Secretary Henry Stimson announced a momentous decision. Japanese Americans would once again be allowed to volunteer for military service, but in a segregated unit. President Roosevelt issued a statement declaring, No loyal citizen of the United States should be denied the democratic right to exercise the responsibilities of his citizenship, regardless of his ancestry. The principle on which this country was founded, and by which it has always been governed, is that Americanism is a matter of the mind and heart. Americanism is not, and never was, a matter of race or ancestry. Oh, it was a beautiful statement. But it rang hollow for families still living behind barbed wire, for citizens still treated as enemies in their own land. Nevertheless, Japanese Americans saw an opportunity, a chance to prove once and for all where their loyalties lay. On February 1st, 1943, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was officially activated at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The government set a goal of 1,500 volunteers from Hawaii. Within weeks, over 10,000 stepped forward, nearly 7 times the number needed. Young men lined up outside recruitment offices, eager for the chance to serve. On the mainland, where Japanese Americans languished in internment camps surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire, the response was more complicated. Many were angry. Why should they fight for a country that had imprisoned them? Their families were behind barbed wire, their property seized, their constitutional rights stripped away. Yet still, approximately 1,200 volunteered from the camps. Frank Wada remembers the day Army recruiters came to Poston, asking men to volunteer for an all-Nisei combat unit. Many of the young men in the camp were torn, but Wada and others decided they would serve. "This country has been good to us," Wada's parents told him. "This is our home." Their motto was chosen by the soldiers themselves: "Go for broke," a gambling term from the streets of Hawaii meaning to risk everything on one great effort. It would prove prophetic. At Camp Shelby in the sweltering heat of Mississippi, over 4,000 young men began their transformation into soldiers. The regiment consisted of the 442nd Infantry, with 3 battalions, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion and the 232nd Combat Engineer Company. The command officers were white. The army wasn't ready to fully trust Japanese Americans with leadership, but the enlisted men and non-commissioned officers were Nisei, and they would prove themselves in ways no one could have imagined. Initially, there was tension within the ranks. 2/3 of the soldiers came from Hawaii, islanders who spoke pidgin English and had never experienced the harsh discrimination of the mainland. They called themselves Buddha heads. 1/3 came from the internment camps on the mainland, young men who had experienced firsthand the sting of American racism. The Hawaiians called them kotonks, the sound a coconut makes when it hits the ground. At first, the two groups clashed. Fistfights broke out. The cultural divide seemed insurmountable. The Hawaiian soldiers couldn't understand why the mainlanders were so quiet, so reserved. The mainland soldiers resented the Hawaiians' loud confidence, their seeming lack of understanding about what it meant to be imprisoned by your own government. But when the Hawaiian soldiers visited the Roa War Relocation Center in Arkansas and saw with their own eyes the conditions their fellow soldiers' families endured, the guard towers, the barbed wire, the tar paper barracks, something changed. They understood finally what their brothers from the mainland had sacrificed to serve. The divisions melted away, they became one unit, one brotherhood. They would need that unity for what was to come. June 1944, the 442nd shipped out to Italy, arriving just as Allied forces were pushing north from Rome. They were joined with the 100th Infantry Battalion, a unit of Japanese-American soldiers from Hawaii who had already distinguished themselves in some of the bloodiest fighting of the Italian campaign. The 100th had earned a grim nickname, the Purple Heart Battalion, for their staggering casualty rate. Among the soldiers of the 100th was a Korean-American lieutenant named Young Oak Kim. When Kim first arrived to lead his platoon, many of the Japanese-American soldiers didn't trust him. Historical tensions between Korea and Japan ran deep. Some soldiers requested transfers rather than serve under him. Kim's response was simple: "There are no Japanese or Koreans here. We're all Americans and we're fighting for the same cause." He would earn their respect through courage and leadership, eventually receiving the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions in combat. On June 26, 1944, near the town of Belvedere, the 442nd entered combat for the first time. The untested soldiers of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions advanced into enemy territory and were immediately pinned down by withering German machine gun fire. Mortars rained down. Men fell. The veteran soldiers of the 100th Battalion, hardened by months of combat, took the lead. They attacked with fury, breaking through the German defensive lines. It was a brutal introduction to war. But the 442nd had passed its first test. In August 1944, the 100th was officially absorbed into the 442nd as its 1st battalion, but in recognition of the 100th's distinguished combat record, it retained its numerical designation. Together, they became the 100th/442nd Regimental Combat Team. The combined unit fought with ferocious determination across the Italian countryside. They were often thrown into the most dangerous operations, the toughest objectives, the strongest enemy positions. In July alone, while advancing toward the Arno River through intense German resistance, they killed over 1,100 enemy soldiers and captured 331 prisoners of war. Private First Class Shizuya Hayashi found himself in the thick of the fighting. On November 29, 1943, near Cerezuolo, Italy, his unit came under devastating fire from German 88mm cannons positioned in the heights. As men fell around him, Hayashi did something that defied all logic and training. He stood up. He charged directly at a German machine gun nest, firing his Browning automatic rifle from the hip. He killed 7 German soldiers and wounded 2 more as they fled. His platoon, inspired by his courage, surged forward another 600 feet. For this action, Hayashi would eventually receive the Medal of Honor. General Mark W. Clark, commander of the Fifth Army, personally praised them. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which has been attached to the 34th Division, has covered itself with glory. The courage and determination displayed by officers and enlisted men reflect the finest traditions of the armed forces of the United States. He added, "These are some of the best fighters in the US Army. If you have more, send them over," but the cost was steep. Companies were devastated, platoons were reduced to handfuls of men, and still they fought on. September 1944, the 442nd was redeployed to France to support the Allied invasion of southern Europe. They fought their way through the French countryside, liberating towns from German occupation. The French civilians welcomed them as heroes, showering them with flowers and wine, unable to believe that these small, dark-skinned soldiers were Americans. "Are you Chinese?" the French would ask. "No, we're Americans," the Nisei soldiers would reply, "but you look Japanese." "We are Japanese Americans, American soldiers." The confusion on French faces would give way to gratitude and embraces. These liberators were unlike any soldiers they had seen. Then came the Vosges Mountains. The Vosges, a densely forested mountain range near the German border that hadn't been breached by a major military force since the Roman Empire 2,000 years before. Adolf Hitler himself had ordered German forces to defend the Vosges at all costs. It was a natural fortress, and the Germans had spent years fortifying it. The mountains were a maze of bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions, and minefields. Every trail was covered by overlapping fields of fire. Every ridge was a killing ground. The 442nd was ordered to take the town of Bruyères, a small but strategically critical communications hub in the heart of the Vosges. What followed was 8 days of hell. The fighting was house to house, room to room. The weather turned brutal. Freezing rain that soaked through uniforms and turned the ground to mud. German machine guns, Hitler's buzzsaws, cut down anyone who moved. Mortar shells exploded without warning. Snipers picked off soldiers from hidden positions. The 442nd fought with everything they had. On October 18th, they entered Bruyères. By October 20th, after 3 days of continuous urban combat, the town was theirs. But there was no time to rest. German forces counterattacked, trying to retake the town. The 442nd held them off. Then came orders to take the nearby town of Bifontaine. More brutal fighting, more casualties. Company Psi of the 3rd Battalion took one hill position with just 8 men left, standing out of 185 who had started the assault. Company K was reduced from 186 men to fewer than 20 effective soldiers. Daniel Inouye, now a platoon sergeant, led his men through the carnage. He watched friends die. He carried wounded soldiers to safety. He killed enemy soldiers who were trying to kill him. This was war in its purest, most terrible form. By October 24th, after 8 days of continuous fighting, Bruyères and Bifontaine were secured. The 442nd had accomplished what others thought impossible, but they had paid dearly. The regiment had lost many of its most experienced officers and enlisted men. Entire companies were at half strength or less. Finally, they were granted rest. They pulled back to a reserve position to recover, to treat the wounded, to mourn the dead. They had earned their rest. They had more than earned it. But their rest would last only 48 hours. October 24th, 1944. While the 442nd rested, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, 275 soldiers from the Texas National Guard, known as the Alamo Regiment, were sent to relieve them on the front lines. The Texans marched into the dense Vosges forest, following what intelligence said was a cleared path. But intelligence was wrong. The Germans had allowed the battalion to march deep into their territory. Then, with brutal efficiency, German forces attacked from all sides, cutting off the Texans completely. Artillery pounded their position. Machine guns created killing fields. The forest itself became a prison. The Lost Battalion, as they came to be known, was trapped, surrounded by thousands of German troops with no hope of escape or resupply. Lieutenant Marty Higgins, a New Jersey native of Irish descent, took command of the surrounded men. He rationed their dwindling supplies with meticulous care. Food was nearly gone. Water was scarce. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Wounded men lay in muddy foxholes with no medical supplies. Every hour that passed, more men died. Adolf Hitler, learning of the situation, personally ordered German commanders. The American battalion must not escape. They must be killed or captured at all costs. 2 American battalions tried to break through the German encirclement. Both attempts failed with devastating casualties. On October 26th, General John Dahlquist made a controversial decision. He called the 442nd back from their rest. Despite their exhaustion, despite their depleted ranks, the Japanese-American soldiers were ordered to rescue the Texans. Many in the 442nd were angry. They had just fought for 8 straight days. They had taken massive casualties. Companies that should have had 200 men had fewer than 50. But orders were orders, and besides, there were American soldiers dying in those woods. If anyone could reach them, the 442nd could. For 5 days, October 26th through October 30th, the 442nd fought through conditions that defied description. They advanced through thick forest in bone-chilling rain. The terrain was treacherous. Steep hills, dense undergrowth, hidden ravines. Visibility was measured in feet, not yards. German artillery rained down constantly. The enemy had pre-sighted every approach. Every path forward was covered by machine gun fire. Mines were hidden everywhere. One wrong step and a soldier was blown apart. The Germans fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. They were often dug into positions that gave them overwhelming advantage. They had more men, better positions, and months of preparation. The 442nd was outnumbered, exhausted, and attacking uphill through a killing zone, but they refused to quit. Medic James Akubo moved through the carnage, treating the wounded under fire. He crawled from foxhole to foxhole, using damp bandages to stanch bleeding. Stabilizing men so stretcher bearers could evacuate them, he worked without sleep, without rest, saving lives while bullets cracked overhead. For his actions during the rescue, Akubo would eventually receive the Medal of Honor, upgraded from a Distinguished Service Cross in 2000. On a ridge that came to be known as Suicide Hill, the fighting reached a level of savagery that shocked even veteran soldiers. Private Barney Hajiro's squad was pinned down by German machine gun fire. Men were dying all around him. Hajiro looked at his fellow soldiers, exhausted, terrified, but determined. He stood up. He screamed, "Banzai!" and he charged. He ran 100 yards through a hail of bullets, across a booby-trapped minefield, straight at the German positions. The entire squad followed, bayonets fixed, firing from the hip, screaming at the top of their lungs. One soldier later recalled, "We yelled our heads off and charged and shot the head off everything that moved. We didn't care anymore. We acted like a bunch of savages. It was primal. It was terrifying. And it worked." The Germans broke and ran. Hajiro single-handedly destroyed 2 machine gun nests. For his courage, he would receive the Medal of Honor, but the cost was staggering. Company 1 of the 3rd Battalion went into the battle with 185 men. When it was over, only 8 walked out unhurt. Company K entered with 186 men. 169 were killed or wounded. over 90% casualties. Both companies were led by sergeants because all their officers had been killed or wounded. Entire platoons were wiped out. Men fought on with wounds that should have killed them. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, Japanese-American artillerymen, provided crucial support fire. 8 forward observers from the 522nd were even part of the assault force. At one point, the artillerymen received fire coordinates that seemed wrong. They double-checked their calculations and discovered the error. Had they fired as ordered, their shells would have landed directly on the lost battalion they were trying to rescue. Their attention to detail saved American lives. On October 30th, after 6 days of desperate combat, elements of the 442nd broke through the German lines. The first soldier to reach the Texans simply walked up, pulled out a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, and asked Lieutenant Higgins, "Want a smoke?" Higgins, hollow-eyed and exhausted, gratefully accepted. As the big Texans passed through to safety, they shook the hands of their small, exhausted but grinning rescuers. Many were crying. Some fell to their knees in gratitude. One Texan looked at the Nisei soldiers and said, "The chills went up our spines when we saw you. Honestly, you looked like giants to us." The 442nd had rescued 211 soldiers of the lost battalion. The cost? Over 800 casualties in the 442nd, more than 3 times the number of men they saved. Some companies had been virtually annihilated, but they had accomplished the mission. They had brought their brothers home. The Texans would never forget. They declared the men of the 442nd Honorary Texans, a bond that would last for generations. November the 12th, 1944. General John Dahlquist ordered the 442nd to assemble for a recognition ceremony on a field in France. As the soldiers formed up, General Dahlquist stood on the reviewing stand, waiting. Minutes passed. He looked confused. Finally, he turned to Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller and demanded, "Where are the rest of your men?" I ordered the entire regiment to assemble. Colonel Miller looked the general in the eye. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "General, this is the regiment. Except for 2 men on guard duty at each company, this is all that is left." The formation before them consisted of cooks, medics, band members, clerks, and a handful of combat-ready soldiers. Not a single company was at even half its normal strength. Some companies had fewer than 20 men. One company was commanded by a staff sergeant. All its officers were dead or wounded. General Dahlquist stood in silence, finally understanding the true cost of the lost battalion rescue. But the 442nd wasn't finished, not by a long shot. They were pulled back to rest and refit. Replacement soldiers arrived, fresh-faced young men who would have to learn what the veterans already knew. War is hell, but the 442nd never quits. In the spring of 1945, the reconstituted regiment was sent back to Italy for the final push against German forces, April 1945. In northern Italy, German forces held a defensive position that had stalled Allied advances for 6 months, the Gothic Line. This was the last major German defensive barrier in Italy, a sophisticated system of bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions and minefields stretching across the mountainous border region. Numerous Allied assaults had failed with heavy casualties. The Gothic Line seemed impregnable. General Mark Clark had a specific request: "Send me the 442nd." On April 5, 1945, in the pre-dawn darkness, the 442nd launched their assault on heavily defended ridges near the town of San Lorenzo. Private First Class Sadao Munamori was with Company A of the 100th Battalion. He carried a photograph of his mother in his pocket, the same mother who waited for him in Manzanar, hoping and praying for his safe return. As the 442nd scaled the mountain heights in darkness, they achieved complete surprise. At 5 a.m. they were in position. Following a massive artillery barrage, they attacked. The advance went well at first. Then the Germans recovered from their shock and fought back with everything they had. Machine guns, rifles, grenades, mortars. The mountain erupted in violence. When Munamori's squad leader fell wounded, Munamori took command. German machine gun fire pinned his squad down. Men were dying. Munamori crawled forward through the hail of bullets. He reached the first machine gun nest and destroyed it with grenades. Then he crawled to the second position and destroyed that one too. As he made his way back to his squad, Seeking cover in a shell crater where 2 of his men had taken refuge, a German grenade hit his helmet and bounced into the crater. There was no time to throw it out, no time for anyone to escape. Munamori looked down and saw the grenade rolling toward his 2 comrades. Without hesitation, he threw himself on top of it. He bent his head over his chest, hunched his shoulders, and smothered the blast with his body. The explosion killed him instantly. The 2 soldiers in the crater suffered concussions and partial deafness, but they survived. Sadao Munamori had saved their lives with his own. Back at Manzanar, his mother Nawa received a telegram. Her son had been killed in action. She took down the Blue Star flag from her barrack window and put it away. A memorial service was held at Manzanar for Sadao and another Nisei soldier killed in action. Among Sadao's personal effects returned to his mother was the photograph he'd carried, her photograph stained with his blood. On March 13th, 1946, Nawa Munamori travelled to Fort MacArthur, California, the same place where her son had enlisted. There, she accepted on his behalf the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. Sadao Munamori was the first Japanese American to receive the Medal of Honor, and for more than 50 years, he would be the only one. As a boy, Sadao had once argued with his older sister. In frustration, he told her, "You just wait. When I grow up, they're going to name a ship after me." Years later, the US Army troopship Wilson Victory was renamed the USNS Private Sadao S. Munamori. His sister Yaeko would stand on that ship's deck, remembering her brother's childhood promise. On April 21st, 1945, Lieutenant Daniel Inouye led his platoon in an assault on German positions near Santorenzo. As Inouye approached the first machine gun nest, he was shot in the stomach. The impact knocked him down, but he got back up. His men tried to pull him back, but he refused. He threw grenades into the first bunker, destroying it. Then he moved to the second position. As he raised his arm to throw another grenade into the second bunker, a German rifle grenade hit him directly in the right arm, nearly severing it completely. Inouye looked down and saw his arm hanging by threads of tissue, his hand still gripping the live grenade. What happened next would become legend. Inouye pried the grenade from his nearly severed right hand using his left hand. He threw it into the bunker with his left hand, destroying it. Then, with his shattered arm dangling uselessly, he continued forward, firing his Thompson submachine gun one-handed at the third machine gun position. Only when he was shot in the leg did he finally collapse. His platoon completed the assault, taking the ridge. Inouye survived, but his right arm was amputated. His dream of becoming a surgeon was over. For this action, he was initially awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. 55 years later, in 2000, it would be upgraded to the Medal of Honor. The 442nd broke through the Gothic line. The defensive position that had held for 6 months fell in days. May 2nd, 1945, German forces in Italy surrendered. 6 days later came victory in Europe. The war was over. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team had fought for 20 months. Approximately 14,000 men served in the unit over the course of the war. The original 4,000 had to be replaced nearly 3.5 times due to casualties. Their record was unprecedented. 21 Medals of Honor, 9,486 Purple Hearts, 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 8 Presidential Unit citations, including 5 earned in just 1 month of fighting, a record unmatched by any other unit in American military history. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the entire history of the United States military. But there's another chapter in this story, one that connects the persecution of Japanese Americans with one of history's darkest crimes. In March 1945, as the 442nd Infantry returned to Italy for the final push, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion was separated from the main unit and sent to support the final Allied advance into Germany. The 522nd became a roving battalion, moving rapidly from position to position, supporting 7 different army units across southern Germany. They covered over 1,100 miles in 60 days, firing more than 11,000 artillery shells. They were the only Japanese-American unit to fight on German soil. In late April 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed, the 522nd was pursuing retreating German forces near Munich when their forward observers noticed something strange. There were people walking through the snow, skeletal figures in striped uniforms stumbling along country roads. At first, the soldiers thought they were seeing things. Were these people, or were they ghosts? Sergeant George Goto would later remember, "You can't imagine what it was like. Their faces were hollow, their eyes sunken. They were just beaten human beings, beyond food, beyond hope. They were living skeletons." The 522nd had stumbled upon survivors of a death march from the Dachau concentration camp system. In the final days of the war, as Allied forces closed in, the SS had evacuated prisoners from Dachau and its subcamps, forcing them on brutal marches toward Austria. Those who fell behind were shot. Those who couldn't walk were left to die. On May 2nd, 1945, soldiers of the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, along with elements of the 4th Infantry Division, encountered thousands of these prisoners near the town of Waakirchen, Bavaria. The SS guards had fled. The prisoners, between 2,700 and 3,300 people, mostly Jews, were scattered across the countryside, dying of starvation, disease, and exposure. Captain Charles Feibelmann, a Jewish officer with the 522nd who had fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s, was among the first Americans to reach the survivors. Several members of his own family had been murdered at Auschwitz. He looked at the scene before him, emaciated prisoners in striped uniforms wandering through a snow-covered field, and turned to Sergeant Joe Obayashi, one of the Nisei soldiers with him. "We must be among the first to get here," Feibelmann said quietly. Although strictly ordered not to share their rations, many of the 522nd soldiers defied those orders. They couldn't just stand by and watch people starve. They built fires to warm the survivors. They shared what little food they had. They found shelter. They provided medical care. They treated these victims of Nazi hatred with the dignity and compassion that their own families had been denied back in America. Private Neil Nagareda would spend the next 50 years wondering, how could people be that cruel to other human beings? The irony was not lost on these Japanese-American soldiers. Many of them had families still imprisoned in camps back in America. Not death camps, but camps nonetheless. They understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to be persecuted for your ancestry. Artilleryman Hideo Nakamine later reflected, "It is ironic that members of one persecuted minority were liberating those of another minority." The 522nd went on to discover and help liberate several Dachau subcamps, including the Kaufering and Landsberg labour camps. For men whose artillery service had often kept them behind the front lines, away from the worst horrors of combat, the sight of the concentration camps left scars that would never heal. Many of the 522nd soldiers were ordered not to speak about what they had seen. For decades they remained silent, carrying the burden alone. It wasn't until years later, in some cases decades later, that they began to share their stories. And when they did, they helped ensure that the world would never forget. July 1946. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team returned to the United States as heroes. At least officially, President Harry S. Truman personally welcomed them to the White House, presenting them with their 7th Presidential Unit citation. His words were powerful. "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you have won. Keep up that fight, and we will continue to win, to make this great republic stand for just what the Constitution says it stands for, the welfare of all the people all the time." It was a beautiful moment, but for many Nisei veterans the fight was far from over. When Japanese-American soldiers returned to their homes, particularly on the West Coast, they found that their sacrifices had not erased the racism they had faced before the war. Some came home to find their property had been seized or sold. Jobs were denied to them. They were refused service in restaurants and shops. Daniel Inouye, now a decorated war hero with one arm, walked into a barbershop in Oakland, California, wearing his army uniform with captain's bars and a chest full of medals. "I don't cut Jap hair," the barber told him. Inouye looked down at his uniform at the empty sleeve where his right arm had been. He had given that arm defending America, and still he was told he wasn't American enough. "Here I am in uniform," Inouye would later recall. "It should be obvious to him that I'm an American soldier, a captain at that. And that fellow very likely never went to war, and he's telling me, we don't cut Jap hair." In Hood River, Oregon, the local American Legion post infamously removed the names of Japanese-American servicemen, including those killed in action, from the town's honor roll. When word of this spread, veterans from across the country wrote letters of outrage. veterans of the Texas National Guard, the men of the Lost Battalion, were among the most vocal in defending their Japanese-American rescuers. More than 300 servicemen in the Pacific Theater wrote to the Hood River News, all but one critical of the American Legion's action. Eventually, under pressure, the American Legion reversed its policy and restored the names. But the damage had been done. The fight for acceptance was gradual. The stories of the 442nd's heroism slowly spread, through the testimony of the soldiers they had saved, through the accounts of commanders who had served with them, through the undeniable evidence of their medals and their sacrifices. In 1952, Daniel Inouye became a lawyer. In 1959, when Hawaii became a state, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, the first Japanese American to serve in Congress. When he took the oath of office, he was asked to raise his right hand. Of course, there was no right hand. It had been lost on a battlefield in Italy defending American ideals. Inouye would go on to serve in the United States Senate for nearly 50 years, becoming one of the most respected and powerful legislators in American history. He served as president pro tempore of the Senate, making him the highest-ranking Asian American politician in U.S. history until his death in 2012. Throughout his political career, Inouye rarely spoke about his Medal of Honor or his war service. When asked why, he would simply say, "I'm no hero. I just did what had to be done." In 1962, Texas Governor John Connally made all veterans of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry Battalion honorary Texans in recognition of their rescue of the Lost Battalion. It was a gesture of profound gratitude from the men they had saved, men who never forgot who had risked everything to bring them home. The Texans would spend the rest of their lives telling the story of the 442nd. They became the unit's most passionate advocates, ensuring that their story would not be forgotten. At every reunion, at every gathering, the surviving members of the Lost Battalion would speak with tears in their eyes about the small Japanese-American soldiers who had charged through hell to save them. They didn't have to do it, one Texan veteran said decades later. Their families were in camps. They had every reason to be bitter, but they came for us anyway. They saved us. I owe them my life. But there remained an injustice that ate at the soul of the nation. Despite the 442nd's incredible record, despite their unprecedented valor, not a single member had been awarded the Medal of Honor during or immediately after the war. 21 Distinguished Service Crosses had been awarded, the nation's second highest decoration. But the Medal of Honor, reserved for the most extraordinary acts of valor, had been denied to every single one of them except Sadao Munamori, who received his posthumously in 1946. The reason was never officially stated, but the pattern was clear. No other Asian American soldier from World War II had received the Medal of Honor for service in Europe. Awards committees had looked at the same acts of heroism that would have earned white soldiers the Medal of Honor and decided the Distinguished Service Cross was sufficient for Japanese Americans. It was discrimination, pure and simple, and it stood as a stain on the nation's honor. In the 1990s, Congress and the military began reviewing these cases. A comprehensive study examined the records of Asian American soldiers who had received the Distinguished Service Cross, looking for cases where discrimination may have prevented them from receiving proper recognition. The evidence was overwhelming. The study found that in case after case, Japanese American soldiers had performed acts of valor that clearly met the criteria for the Medal of Honor, yet had been passed over. On June 21, 2000, 55 years after the end of the war, President Bill Clinton stood in the White House surrounded by elderly Japanese American veterans and their families. President Clinton spoke with emotion. Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill-treated. He awarded the Medal of Honor to 21 Asian American veterans, 20 from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and 1 from the 100th Infantry Battalion. 15 of the medals were presented posthumously. But 6 recipients, including Senator Daniel Inouye, were there to finally receive the recognition they had earned more than half a century earlier. At age 75, with his left hand, Senator Inouye accepted America's highest military honor. He stood straight and tall, the same young warrior who had charged German machine gun nests, now an elder statesman. When asked how it felt to finally receive the Medal of Honor after so many years, he said simply, "It means that America has finally come to terms with its conscience." The ceremony lasted nearly 2 hours. Family members of the fallen came forward to accept medals on behalf of fathers, grandfathers, uncles who had died never knowing that their nation would eventually acknowledge what they had done. Barney Hajiro, the man who had charged German positions on Suicide Hill, was there to receive his medal in person. He was 84 years old, still strong, still proud. Shizuya Hayashi, who had single-handedly destroyed a German machine gun nest in Italy, received his medal at age 80. James Akubo's family accepted his medal. The medic who had saved countless lives in the Vosges Mountains had died years before, never knowing his Distinguished Service Cross would be upgraded. The family of Sadao Munamori attended as well. Though he had received his Medal of Honor in 1946, they wanted to be there for the others, for the brothers in arms who had served alongside Sadao, who had shared his courage and his sacrifice. In 2010, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow, to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the 100th Infantry Battalion, and the Military Intelligence Service. The Military Intelligence Service had been another group of Japanese-American heroes, linguists and translators who had served in the Pacific, translating captured Japanese documents and interrogating prisoners. Their work was so secret that even their families didn't know what they did. For decades after the war, they couldn't tell anyone about their service. But their intelligence work saved countless American lives and shortened the war by years. Now, finally, they too were being honoured. In 2012, surviving members of the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion were made Knights of the French Legion of Honour for their role in liberating France and their assistance in liberating the Dachau subcamps. The French government's citation read, "These men risked their lives in the name of freedom and human dignity. France will never forget their courage and their sacrifice. The honours came late, too late for many who had already passed away, but they came, and with each honour, each recognition, each medal, America acknowledged a fundamental truth. These men had been right all along. Their loyalty had never been in question, except by those who should have known better." Today, the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team stands as one of the most extraordinary chapters in American military history. These young men, whose families were imprisoned by their own government, chose to serve anyway. Not because it was easy, not because they were assured of recognition or respect, but because they believed in the ideals that America represented, even when America failed to live up to those ideals. They fought 2 wars, one against Nazi tyranny in Europe, another against prejudice and injustice at home. They won both. The men of the 442nd proved that courage has no colour, no ethnicity, no borders. They proved that loyalty is not determined by the shape of your eyes or the colour of your skin, but by the content of your character and the choices you make when everything is on the line. They were told they were enemy aliens. They responded by becoming American heroes. They were imprisoned without trial. They responded by fighting for freedom. They were doubted. They responded with blood and sacrifice. When Barney Hajiro charged that machine gun nest on Suicide Hill, he wasn't thinking about proving anything to anyone. He was thinking about his brothers beside him, Hawaiian boys and mainland boys, all of them now just Americans fighting together. When Sadao Munamori threw himself on that grenade, he wasn't making a political statement. He was doing what any soldier would do for his family, and the 442nd had become his family, a brotherhood forged in fire and blood. When Daniel Inouye pried that grenade from his shattered right hand and threw it left-handed into the German bunker, he was simply doing his duty. The duty of a soldier. The duty of an American. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the US Army, perhaps said it best. They were superb. They showed rare courage and tremendous fighting spirit. Not complaint in the record. Everybody wanted them. Today, the 442nd lives on as the 100th Battalion, 442nd Infantry Regiment in the US Army Reserve, the only infantry formation in the reserve to trace its lineage to World War II. Young soldiers of all backgrounds now serve in this unit, carrying on the legacy of the Nisei warriors who came before them. Their battle cry still echoes, "Go for broke." And in those 3 words lies the essence of who they were. Young men who risked everything, their lives, their futures, their very souls, on the belief that America could be better than it was, that it could live up to its founding promises, that courage and sacrifice could overcome hatred and fear. They went for broke, and they won more than battles. They won hearts, they won minds, they won justice, however delayed. They changed America. They proved that patriotism doesn't depend on where your grandparents were born, but on what you're willing to fight for, to bleed for, to die for. The mountains of France and Italy witnessed their valour. The forests of the Vosges drank their blood. The Gothic line felt their fury. The prisoners of Dachau saw their compassion, and history remembers. In schools across America, children learn about the 442nd. In military academies, cadets study their tactics and their courage. In Japanese American communities, their legacy is passed down from generation to generation, a source of pride and a reminder of the price that was paid for acceptance. The story of Frank Wada, who volunteered from behind barbed wire at Poston, is now part of the National Park Service exhibits at the internment campsites. Visitors walk through the same desert where he and his family were imprisoned, and they learn why he chose to serve anyway. The story of Sadao Munamori, who saved his comrades with his own body, is taught at the US Army schools as an example of selfless service and sacrifice. The story of Daniel Inouye, who lost his arm but gained a Medal of Honor and went on to serve his nation for another half-century in the Senate, reminds us that service doesn't end when the shooting stops. The Nisei soldiers of the 442nd didn't just fight for America, they fought for the idea of America, the promise that all people are created equal, that justice and freedom are for everyone, that your worth is measured by your actions, not your ancestry. They believed in that promise even when America didn't believe in them. And through their courage, through their sacrifice, through their unwavering determination, they helped make that promise more real for everyone who came after them. When President Truman told them they had fought prejudice and won, he was only half right. They had won a major battle, but the war against prejudice would continue. Yet they had proven something crucial, that prejudice could be fought, could be challenged, could be overcome. Every Asian American who serves in the military today stands on the shoulders of the 442nd. Every Asian American who runs for public office benefits from the path that Daniel Inouye and others blazed. Every time someone of any minority background achieves something despite discrimination, they are carrying forward the legacy of the Nisei soldiers who refused to accept the limitations others placed on them. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit for its size in American military history. Japanese Americans who proved their loyalty in the only way their country would accept, with courage under fire and blood on foreign soil. They were warriors, they were heroes, they were Americans, and their story will never be forgotten. The motto, "Go for broke," has become more than just a regimental slogan. It has become a philosophy, a way of life, a reminder that sometimes you have to risk everything to achieve what truly matters. These young men went for broke. They bet everything on America. Even when America had given them little reason to believe, they wagered their lives on the promise that courage could overcome prejudice, that sacrifice could earn respect, that loyalty could be proven through action, and they won. Not just the battles in France and Italy, not just the medals and the citations. They won something far more important. They won the right to be seen as fully American. They won recognition that loyalty and courage know no racial boundaries. They won a place in American history that can never be taken away. Today, when we see the American flag waving, we should remember that Japanese American soldiers bled for that flag, even when that flag flew over the camps where their families were imprisoned. When we speak of American values like courage, honor, and sacrifice, we should remember that the 442nd embodied those values in their purest form. Their legacy endures, in the faces of their children and grandchildren, in the freedoms we enjoy, in the more perfect union they helped create through their sacrifice. They were the unit German commanders feared. But more importantly, they were the unit that proved America's promise of equality could be real. They were the men who changed a nation through courage, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief in the American ideal. Go for broke.